Oh, my guest is here. Excellent. 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 My man. How you doing, David? You doing okay today?
Yeah, not bad. You?
I am doing well. Better that you are with me. Um, Wait, there's something going on with your video. Move for me. I want to see if. Oh, okay, okay. It's that may be on my end. My
Right.
Wi-Fi has been a little bit weird. But I'm glad you could join me, man. Just so the audience will know, David. Please pronounce your last name. It's been a while since I've seen. I don't want to f it up.
Hundeyin.
Thank you. Okay, so I was right. David Hundeyin. He, if I can pull it up on my calendar, there we are. David Hundeyin. He's an investigative journalist, author, filmmaker, founder of West Africa Weekly, and is a 2023 James Curry Fellow at Cambridge University. I always have to tell myself it's not who died, it's who day. But I was right. In my head, I was right. I should have just went for it. Thank you for joining me, man. I hope you're doing okay today.
Yeah, very much so.
I I came across. Well, let's start with Madagascar first. And I'm not even sure if you know what is taking place in Madagascar. Obviously, there's the basics. The military has effectively joined the crowd. The crowd was in massive protests. France flew out the president of Madagascar. France made it very clear, hey, we're not getting militarily involved. We just flew the president out. We're not going to engage in your internal processes. The president effectively said it's a coup. From my understanding, this president came to power in a coup several years prior, even though he eventually won an election, which is why he was in now. The audience or the people were very angry about electricity, poverty, corruption, etc. Basically, something that's in every country. I don't know what is going on beyond that. And I'm not sure if you've paid attention to this issue. Can you give us a heads up
I,
on this?
I have paid some attention to it. In my newsroom, we have paid some attention to it, but we're also going to be honest enough to say that even for us on the continent, we're still waiting for more information because there's several contradictory pieces of information. So, for example, you were right in saying that he's been evacuated by the French. He was evacuated on the French military aircraft. He himself, that's the president who has just been overthrown, he himself is a dual French citizen. So he's a French Madagascar citizen. So on the surface, what that would appear to tell you is that this is some sort of popular uprising against a French-backed, um, you know, puppet. However, where the contradiction then comes in is when you examine his record. This is somebody whose domestic policy has been very, very, very left wing. I'll go as far as to call it socialist.
Yeah.
So under his tenure as president, subsidies have been introduced for everything. He's governed very, very well to the left of center. So, if this were some sort of uprising against, I don't know, an imperialist backed president or something, like the picture doesn't fit. It's not a neat narrative. So it's actually quite hard to say what exactly is going on. What we do know is that the French government appears to have some sort of an interest in keeping him safe.
Yeah.
On the other hand, we also do know that it would not be accurate to describe him as just your typical African French-backed, puppet president whose job is to hemorrhage the country's natural resources. To France, that's not really true in this case. So I guess the information that we need to know is how did these protests actually come to be? Because that's what will tell us what is actually going on here. All we know so far is that it's a Gen Z-led protest against the usual things that Gen Zs have been protesting about all over the world, from Africa to Asia to Europe. But as we saw with the events in Nepal and in Indonesia and in Bangladesh, these easy narratives about, oh, there's corruption, the Gen Zs they're not having it. Those are just smoke screens more often than not. More often than not, there's a hand behind the scenes guiding things along. So in the case of Nepal, I think we now know, all of us should know by now, it was the hand of Ned, which is basically the CIA. In this case, we simply don't know. That's the honest to God truth. We have no idea. There's a significant non-zero possibility that this is actually some sort of organic uprising, um, which would be surprising to me if that were the case, because again, the fact that the military joined, effectively joined the protest by stating that they were not going to um, enforce, military order on what
Right.
was a rapidly deteriorating security situation, suggests to me that there's been some coordination behind the scenes, and potentially at least some parts of the military were already in on it. And if that is the case, it then begs the question: so who has the capacity to put such a plot together, which would suggest some sort of international geopolitical actor. But until we know who that actor is, it's extremely difficult to say. Which is why in our newsroom we barely covered it. We're kind of waiting to see more information emerge before taking a position on it.
Oh, thank you for that, and thank you for your honesty on that. Because this is one of those things where you look at it, you be like, okay, what just happened? What just took place, right?
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
you have the military who effectively says, okay, we're going to side with the protesters. And then he's like, I'm going to declare myself president. I think what, October 18th or 19th is going to be coming up pretty soon, where he's effectively going to swear himself in
Yeah.
as the power broker. Do we know anything about the guy who is taking power in this case?
I guess in the coming few hours and days, we'll know a lot more about him. Right
Okay.
now, personally, from our point of view, is a completely unknown quantity.
Wow.
So again, which is why I said it's been very difficult to get a handle on exactly what it is that is going on here. If indeed this is something which has been orchestrated behind the scenes, then this has been very, very well organized, has been very well coordinated. This has been done in a way that has been very successful at obscuring, at least for the moment, who is behind it. So I'm very curious to see what information emerges
Yeah.
over the coming few
Oh,
days.
yeah. I mean, when they say the president was flown out, what is the how's France related to this? 'Cause you told me once before that in one of the states, when there was like this kind of uprising, France brought in military in order to put
Yes.
down the
Yes.
uprising. And in this case,
Yes.
France was very clear. Hey, we're just taking them out. Continue on with what you guys are doing, which to me is super suspicious, right? Because
Yes,
it's
it
like,
is. Yes, it
yeah,
is. So, if again, this is a theory. This is not something which has been confirmed in any meaningful way, but a theory floating around in our newsroom is that potentially this person was installed by France and then, for whatever reason, decided to try and basically rebel, to go against the grain, which has happened in other places before.
yeah,
Where a president comes in with the backing of foreign power and then decides to become a nationalist afterwards. And foreign power is like, no, we put you there, we can take you out. So it's possible that that happened here. Because again, the circumstances under which he took power, he basically took power in a coup in 2009. And even though he was a civilian, the military backed him, which again suggests that this is not just anybody. This is someone with some significant geopolitical standing and value. So potentially, so this theory is that maybe this is some sort of French asset who was parachuted into that position and then went rogue and decided to become a Madagascar nationalist. And then the mothership in Paris was like, no, we can't have that.
time
So
for you to go. Yeah,
you know, here's a color revolution, but we'll take you out. You'll be safe, but you're not. We're not having any of that right now. So again, it's just a theory, but I guess if it's the closest thing that we have to a sort of plausible explanation for why there's so many contradictory things happening.
color revolutions are a powerful device, man, because it's hard. Like
Extremely very much.
because it puts you in a situation as a leader of, do we shoot a population? And depending upon the population, especially if, let's say, for example, the grievances are real. Let's take the poll, where you have people who are really pissed off about real things. And yet those people are effectively being directed as useful idiots to accomplish an objective.
Yeah,
It's like, okay,
exactly.
well, how do you do? Like, how do you deal with that, right? Like, as a government, what do? You can't, that they're well-meaning, meaning in regards to what they want. You also know that they're being led and directed by a foreign entity. I don't, how do you, like, You can't send your military out to
It's
shoot
it's an
the population.
unsolvable problem. It's an
Yeah,
unsolvable problem, and that's why the mechanisms that activate color revolutions in other people's countries are so dangerous. And that's why for any country that has any plans of gaining or retaining sovereignty, gaining control of the civic space, or at least visibility over the civic space, is a top priority, because how color revolutions work is that they effectively weaponize the population against the government, right? So um, in a situation where, for example, a developing country, a resource-rich developing country that has something that a richer country wants, and the richer country would remain for this developing country to remain poor, and then you have, say, a government that has the opposite ambition. This government wants to develop the country. It doesn't want to sell natural resources cheaply. It wants to move up the value chain. All of those things that you're supposed to do to develop. And in the process of doing some of these things, certain decisions, tough decisions, have to be made. Unavoidably, this has been the case everywhere in the world, both in the West and in the East. And then you have these actors, these characters that foment color revolutions, then exploiting these local grievances, and because grievances always exist everywhere,
yeah,
exploiting those, and then putting money into those cracks and turning those little cracks and fissures into huge problems, until eventually a crisis is basically manufactured out of nothing. And then you have the desired regime change operation, which is the goal of color revolution. So this has been done to very great effect across parts of Eastern Europe. It has been done in parts of Asia. It has been done in Africa, probably more than anywhere else. So I think now, more than ever at this point in time, um, governments, especially in the global south, which have any ambition whatsoever of attaining development, need to see um, foreign actors that are involved in their civil society spaces and their civic spaces and their information and journalism spaces as potential attack vectors. They need to see them the same way they see foreign troops.
yeah.
So the same way most of them would reflexively reject the deployment of foreign troops on their soil, they also need to see foreign information agents the same way. Because I would argue actually that a color revolution is actually much more dangerous, much more injurious to the fabric of a society than a simple invasion, right? Because the military invasion is something which can be repelled. It's something which it's like the people know who the enemy is, so there's a very clear and easily definable objective for how to reverse it. A color revolution, on the other hand, is not just about executing regime change. It's about morphing the character of a society. It's about changing a culture, basically terraforming an entire country's character without its consent. That, to me, is a lot more insidious and a lot more dangerous than simple military invasion. And we've seen this, for example, the country that I come from, Nigeria, where in 2015, that was a color revolution. Some would say the original African color revolution of the 21st century, because that template has been rolled out elsewhere since then. And what has happened since then is that the divisions that already existed within Nigerian society have now become so pronounced that conversations that I never used to hear as a child, conversations, for example, about potentially breaking up Nigeria, about some regions seceding and becoming an independent country,
Really?
having a sovereign referendum, and this one breaking off, Nigeria potentially breaking off into 6 or 9 little ethno states, that sort of thing. These were not conversations that I was ever familiar with, that I was ever acquainted with, having
Wait,
grown
just to
up
be
and
clear,
spent.
you're saying this is happening now in Nigeria, where they're
Yes,
having
yes, it
conversations about
absolutely
breaking
is.
Nigeria. Wow.
It absolutely is right now. And the reason it is happening is because the type of um, machinations that made 2015 possible operated through exploiting these divisions. These divisions already existed. Nigeria has fought a civil war before in between 1967 and 1970. But by the time I came around in 1990, you couldn't see this was a country that was clearly healing. I wouldn't say it had healed, but it was healing. And then all of a sudden, a foreign actor from another continent decides, how do we get the change of government that we want to a more pliant regime that will do the things that we want them to do? Because this current government is becoming more closely affiliated with China. They're becoming a bedrock of China's Belt and Road Initiative strategy in Africa. They're taking on a lot of Chinese infrastructure investment. If this continues, basically, they're going to stop being poor. They're going to stop playing the role that they play in the global economy, which threatens our place in the global economy. So how do we change that? And how do we ensure that we don't just change a government, but we also make it impossible for the conditions for a nationalist government to emerge again? How do we do that? We do that by exploiting these divisions that had very nearly been forgotten about, and we create problems where they didn't exist. So, when I was growing up the commercial capital of Nigeria, which is Lagos, a city of 21 million people, it's the largest city in Africa, there was never a question, for example, about who is allowed to live in Lagos, because Lagos was just thought of as it's the melting pot of Nigeria. Lagos is where everything happens in Nigeria. Now we've started having conversations about who owns Lagos. Oh, it belongs to this ethnic group, and if you don't speak this language, you're not allowed to run for office in Lagos. Things which never used to exist. Lagos has always been multi-ethnic, has been governed by multiple people from multiple ethnicities, and that has never been a problem. All of a sudden now, in 2025, it has become a major topic for conversation out of nowhere all of a sudden. These were not conversations that existed before, and that is a direct result of the color revolution that took place in 2015, because it wasn't just a regime change, it was a total morphing of Nigeria's national character. So taking us from a place where we thought of ourselves as a generally cohesive country, not a completely cohesive country, there were problems, but generally speaking, a country that has some sort of group identity, and then fractured into these little micro-ethnic, micro-religious identities, such that now to express a Nigerian nationalist position in the public space, which I do regularly, almost comes across as inauthentic, because it's become almost a strange thing now. And this is something which has been externally orchestrated. So in the space of 10 years, the entire idea of what it means to be Nigerian has been shifted. And that shift wasn't locally orchestrated. It was orchestrated from Washington, D.C. So that's the danger that color revolutions present. And that's why governments around the world, especially in the global south, must see foreign actors in their civic, information, and civil society spaces as threats, and must treat them as such. At the very least, that would mean, for example, introducing the same kind of legislation that the US has, for example. So the Foreign Agents Registration Act, for example. Most countries in the global south do not have equivalent legislation. So the kind of political activity that you will not be able to carry out in the US as a foreigner, Americans are able to come to your country and do that all willy-nilly without any restriction whatsoever. Like if I were to go to the US and try to take part in a US presidential campaign to influence the ways that Americans vote, and I'm a Nigerian citizen, I would go to prison for 5 years if I did that and I wasn't registered as a foreign agent under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. In Nigeria, there is no such legislation, so an American can come and do that, which is why you had David Axelrod. You might know him very well. He ran the 2015 presidential campaign in Nigeria for the candidate that eventually won, Obama's candidate, right? That is essentially a federal crime in the US, but in Nigeria, it's perfectly fine.
Yeah, Georgia is a really good example where they were trying to affect, if you remember, Georgia was trying to get a FARA type law, and Europe and the US freaked out.
They called it the Russian law.
Yeah, but it was a U.S. law. The U.S.
exactly.
law into play. And Georgia was like, how are you freaking out when you have the same law? And of course, the reason was obvious, right? We have a ton of money that is in Georgia. We're trying to overthrow that government because we want to effectively use them as a second front for the war in Ukraine. But Europe lost their minds over this. Does Africa know what you just pointed out? This idea that when you have these NGOs, when you have these embassies, when you have let's say these foreign entities that are in your country, that these things are not necessarily being used on the up and up, that they are also being used as a vector to go after the internal stability of the country itself, especially in the context of protests?
Unfortunately, a lot of this information is just, it exists, it's there, people can Google it, it's there, but unfortunately, it's just not present in the public space in this part of the world. Unfortunately, to even talk about these things in this part of the world, one might get labeled a conspiracy theorist, for example, right? And that's not by accident, because I'm sure it wouldn't surprise you to know the Americans have been hard at work putting certain sort of thought-terminating terms and cliches into heavy rotation in the public space in Africa. So, for example, that term, conspiracy theorist, 10 years ago, that term didn't exist in the Nigerian public lexicon. Now you see it on Nigerian social media every day. You see it in African social media every day. Again, that's that influx of foreign influence to the point of even morphing your vocabulary, your grammar, and morphing how you think about yourself, and how you think about ideas, and how you think about thinking, right? That's the very clever thing that has been done. So unfortunately, no, a lot of this information to most people in this part of the world is just either something completely academic and seemingly of no relevance to them, or it's just, oh, these guys come again. It's these Pan-Africanist people and their conspiracy theories, always blaming white people for everything. They never take responsibility for their problems, and yada, yada, yada. That's like, these are the things that are used to terminate thoughts in this part of the world. And unfortunately, they're very successful.
David, your mic is it's cracking a bit. Is there any way that you can either come in, like go out and come back in, or try to adjust just a little bit, because it's difficult to hear?
I hope that is better.
Say a few more words.
Yeah, well, so I've brought it a bit closer, so I hope that works.
Oh no, you're fine. Okay, that sounds fine. No, you sound good. You sound good. Yeah, man, that's wild. This is one of those things that Brian Berletti talks about, controlling information space. Like how countries need to have the capability of controlling the information. Like it's always, that sucks, but it's always dicey. The moment that you're controlling, like I'll give you an example. Europe decides, well, we obviously need to control our information space. Okay, how do you do that? Well, we're going to get rid of RT and Sputnik. And hey, we may even get rid of, the other network that they kept claiming was associated with Russia. We're just going to do that. And it's like, okay, but you guys are just lying. Like you've effectively eliminated any opposition point of view in your societies. And my ex, the stuff that you used to tell me, I used to be like, you really believe that? Like that's what they're telling you guys?
But the thing is, regardless of whether they're lying or not, there's still something to take away from that. And that something is, regardless of whether it's true or not, that Russia is guilty of certain things or not, and RT deserve to be deplatformed or whatever. The point is, the Europeans identified what they thought of as their interests, and identified what they thought of as a foreign influence that was contrary to their interests. And they took action to cut off what they considered to be that foreign influence that was inimical to their interests. So I think countries in the global south can borrow that way of reasoning, that you need to identify where your interests lie and identify where opposing interests lie, because you do have enemies, you do have opposing interests. You're not floating in the sky, without context. You're part of a global reality, and you do have enemies. So you need to identify who those enemies are, who those opposing interests are, where their information attack vectors exist in your countries, and you need to isolate and eliminate them. Exactly the same way the Europeans have done. Whether they were justified in doing that to RT or not, the point is those are the rules upon which the world works. Those are the real rules upon which the world works. The world works on the rules of enlightened self-interest. And unfortunately, in the global south, instead of operating under the rules of enlightened self-interest, we operate under this fiction called international law, which is a total fiction, right? We operate under the idea that there's an international community, there's a global rules-based system. There is no such thing. It's the jungle out here. That's just the reality. So we need to act like we live in the jungle, and we need to survive. Our primary responsibility to ourselves is to survive.
Agree. Yeah, you have my perfect agreement. I guess that I am being selfish when I'm thinking about this, because I'm thinking about like, I give you an example, but everything you said was correct. This is a jungle, and you do need to control your information space. I guess the issue that I have is sometimes countries themselves are the enemies of the people, and in the way that they're deciding that this is in our interests. That interest may end up getting a bunch of Europeans killed, or in the U.S. where they decide, hey, it's in our interest to buy TikTok and say how awesome Israel is on TikTok. It's like, okay, is that really in my interest, right? That's not.
Yeah.
This is somebody else's interest, not mine. Governments will do that, and I know governments will do that because that's what Europe is doing. That's what the United States on some level is doing. So I don't know. It just sucks. You're right. There's no, rules-based order. It's just the jungle, and you have to deal with the fact that it's the jungle, and you just hope governments are being more honest in the way that they deal with their populations, even though governments are governments.
Fingers crossed on that.
Yeah. I came across this guy who was talking about Russia and Sudan. It confused the hell out of me. Please. What is Russia's role in the Sudan war? Let's just.
I will be the first person to say I have absolutely no idea, because in as much as I follow the goings on in Sudan very closely, Russia is like the only, or one of the few major geopolitical actors that I simply haven't heard much from in the context of Sudan. So I've heard a lot about the involvement of the Gulf powers, specifically the UAE, and to a lesser extent Qatar and Saudi Arabia. I've heard something about the potential involvement of Egypt, because there's a whole other angle of Egypt's supposed interest in the destabilization of Sudan, because as I'm sure you know, the Nile River, which supplies 95% of Egypt's water needs, flows through Sudan into Egypt, and partly as a result of the new dam that was recently inaugurated in Ethiopia, Egypt sees a threat to its continued existence through more potential constructions along the Nile basin. So the theory goes that supposedly Egypt is helping to keep Sudan stabilized, so that Sudan doesn't have the stability needed to build infrastructure along the Nile basin, so that Egypt can keep on getting water. So I've heard a lot of these things, but I've never heard about anything concerning Russia. So that could be my sort of professional blind spots. That could be my ignorance. I don't know. So I will need to do significantly more research on that to be able to offer anything.
But that is wild to me. So the African countries, despite the fact that there's an African Union, they still have their petty grievances and their
absolutely. So in this case, the grievance stems from it was a colonial era document that was created by the British, supposedly dividing the usage rights for the Nile. Now, unfortunately, the Brits, being the notorious racists that they were, didn't consider Ethiopians to be human. They're like Africans. So Ethiopia was not even included in the agreement. So it was basically an agreement between Egypt and, to a lesser extent, Sudan. And that was pretty much it. Ethiopia, where an estimated 85% of the Nile originates from, and Uganda, where I think 15% originates from, they were not included in this agreement. So according to this colonial era treaty, Ethiopia and Uganda basically have no rights to the Nile River, even though they are the sources of the Nile River.
Did you say 80% of the Nile River comes through Ethiopia or comes out of Ethiopia?
85%.
Egypt has built dams.
Multiple dams.
They have claimed almost like ownership of the Nile.
Exactly, exactly. But obviously, the Nile does not originate in Egypt. It originates from the highlands of East Africa. So it's
Yeah.
Ethiopia and Uganda. So the Blue Nile and the Brown Nile from Uganda, the Blue Nile from Ethiopia, which converge and then become the Nile, which flows into Egypt and then empties out into the Red Sea. So Egypt, based on this colonial era treaty, believes that it essentially owns the Nile, which it doesn't. And obviously, the Ethiopians beg to disagree. So they constructed this huge dam, this 2,000 megawatt hydroelectric dam called the
I've
Great
seen it.
Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam.
Yeah, I've seen it.
And the Egyptians have been going absolutely crazy about it, have been threatening to carry out an airstrike on the dam, have been threatening war and all sorts of things. And the issue is not just potentially that the dam is going to restrict water flow, because it's not. The issue actually, which I guess the Egyptians are being very coy about, the issue is that historically, I don't know if you're aware of this, this is something that goes back thousands of years actually. Back to the ancient Egypt of antiquity. It used to be a thing of great that used to puzzle them, that during the dry season in Egypt, the Nile actually had strengthened flows. So, like, you would expect that during the dry season, the volume of the Nile would shrink. It would actually expand, and then it would bring fertile soils with it, which is how come the Nile estuary in Egypt is one of the most fertile places in the world. So basically, all of Egypt's irrigated agriculture takes place within the Nile estuary.
Interesting.
And what was later discovered thousands of years later was that the reason that happens is that during that hot season, because the water originates from the highlands in East Africa, which are icy. So during the hot season, it's like kind of like the Himalayas and the monsoon season in India, something similar. So during the hot season, more water is melted, so more water flows into the Nile, which is how come Egypt essentially experiences a blessing during its wash time.
Yeah.
And those fertile soils are coming from Ethiopia and Uganda. Now, what the dam potentially might do is it will allow water, it's not going to significantly change water flow because the dam doesn't consume water, it just redirects it. So Egypt will be fine with water flow. But those fertile soils, which basically save Egypt billions of dollars every year in fertilizer costs, those fertile soils are no longer going to flow into Egypt. So Egypt is going to have to start spending a lot more money on
That's right.
fertilizer for agriculture. That is actually what this issue is about. The Egyptians don't want to come out and say it. So they're making it about water. It's not actually about water. It's much more than just water. So the theory goes that they have an interest in maintaining both Sudan and Ethiopia in a relative state of underdevelopment because that benefits Egypt. Um, and yes, you're right in saying that it's the job of the African Union to mediate on issues like this and ensure that whatever treaty or agreement is arrived at ensures equitable sharing of resources for everyone along
Right.
the riparian routes of the river. Unfortunately, the AU, as I've mentioned to you before, is essentially a vassal organization of the European Union. It's majority funded by the European Union. So um, the actual mechanisms that are supposed to handle things like this are basically either dormant or non-existent. The only AU mechanisms that actually work are things relating to things that the EU has an interest in. So if the EU doesn't have a direct interest in whether Egypt wants to go to war with Ethiopia or Sudan or whatever, then that issue just kind of lies on the back burner forever. And that's kind of the situation we're in. So both countries are involved in like a war of words now, just shooting official statements back and forth. Ethiopia is accusing Egypt of colonial era thinking and being self-serving. Egypt is accusing Ethiopia of collaborating with Israel to construct a dam that it didn't need to construct, and accusing Ethiopia of taking funding from Israel to construct the dam, which then interpreted as an insult, and it's a whole lot of back. So that's where we are.
Wow, you were working with a genocidal state. They went nuclear. They went nuclear on that one. Jesus. I mean, have you noticed an energy? And let me ask this. I know this is going to sound somewhat strange, but with the Sahel states and this overt advocation, or this overt advocation of sovereignty, has that bled into other parts of Africa? Like, meaning, if you're the African Union and you're watching this take place, as you point out, this is something that obviously of their purview. You would think that it's in their purview to not have member states militarily attacking each other. When they see like the Sahel states, and they see these states pushing very heavy in this notion of sovereignty, heavy in this notion of self-development of the individual states themselves, does that have an effect on the larger African continent that you've been able to see in the context of the countries themselves? Especially the countries that are beside it. You would think that the countries beside it will see the development that's taking place in those states. And I don't know, would it change them?
It is definitely having an effect. It's certainly having a political effect. So um, I don't know if you saw the news a few weeks back that Niger and Burkina Faso are currently cooperating with Russia on constructing nuclear reactors in
Yes.
both countries. Shortly after that announcement was made, Ethiopia made its own announcement, and it's also going into a collaboration with, I believe, Rosatom, which is the Russian state-owned nuclear energy company, to construct its own nuclear reactor. Um,
Interesting.
because obviously Ethiopia historically has been, generally speaking, more eastern aligned than western aligned anyway. Which is not to say that Ethiopia is some, anti-imperialist stronghold. It's not. But historically, generally speaking, it's been more eastern than western aligned, and it has over 100 million people. It considers itself as a country which rightfully ought to be one of the largest economies in Africa. So it's actually making moves toward that end. So it's expanding its public infrastructure stock. It's expanding its access to power and energy, which is why the dam that I referenced earlier was so important, or is so important to it. And so construction of nuclear reactors now, I think, is a statement of intent, right? Because that's that. Usually that tends to be the sort of red line that most African countries are just afraid of getting to. That once you mention the word nuclear, then you get the world searchlight beamed on your head, and you don't want that kind of attention. But for these countries to come out and openly state, for a country like Ethiopia to come out and openly state that it's constructing a nuclear reactor, I think that's a very big that's a very bold statement. And then even as far afield as Botswana, which is like right down at the southern tip of the continent, the new president, who, he may or may not be serious about it, he may or may not mean it, but he has been making references to the Sahelian states. He has been he delivered a speech that I watched recently where he mentioned that the structure of the electoral or the democratic system that he operates in essentially acts as a constraint for him to actually get things done. And he actually referenced Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina
Yes.
Faso as someone who can wake up and give instructions and ensure that things get done. Meanwhile, he has to go through this whole rigmarole for the slightest thing to happen. That obviously that's not an action, but that's a sign that politically everyone across the continent has taken notice.
Oh, that's
Whether
fascinating.
that's going to lead to a political revolution as far afield as Botswana, we honestly don't know that yet. But I mean, I'll also mention something else. In South Africa, which is like right at the southern tip of the continent, there
Right.
are politicians in South Africa who are actually right now, as we speak, in Burkina Faso. If you're familiar with the party called the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF,
Yes.
which is led by Julius Malema, they actually have an ongoing, a sort of ongoing engagement, like on-ground engagement in Burkina Faso with the Burkinabe government. I spoke to someone from that party, a lady called, her name is Prof. Kainsile Shabalala Litchfield. She's currently in, or she was last week. I don't know if she's still there, but she goes back and forth a lot. I believe she's a serving MP under
Mhm.
the EFF, and she basically, she engages directly with with the Burkina government. I know there are other political formations across Southern Africa that have similar direct engagement with the Sahelian government. So I'm not going to sit here and make a prediction that by so and so year, so and so, such and such spectacular event is going to have happened. I think that's a fool's errand. However, what I will say is that both on the ground and in the ivory towers, everyone across the continent has taken notice. I think the major reason that they're taking notice is that, first of all, these three countries, having made what I consider to be some of the boldest decisions that have been made in post-colonial African history, are still standing. The governments are still strong. Because typically, what would have happened is that by this time there would have been some color revolution that would have been staged. There would have been a coup. There would have been a massive breakdown in local security. So I guess the whole continent was just kind of waiting to see that is that going to happen this time? And it's not happened at all. And in fact, these countries are on a construction binge, and everyone is slowly coming around to the realization that, okay, these guys may have cracked the code. These guys may have figured out how to get this thing done. So it will start, like in the case of Ethiopia, it's just one. So it will start as a trickle and then a deluge. So I'm definitely seeing signs of that trickle. We're not there yet. Absolutely not. It's still very much a very small trickle.
Yeah.
But once I guess the proof of concept has been tested, then it becomes a deluge. When exactly that will be, it's a fool's errand to say. But I'm fairly confident that within my lifetime, certainly, I'm going to see it happen.
You can see it. Yeah, God, man, it's so complicated because it's a mental issue on some level. Weirdly enough, part of it is mental, and part of it is physical. And what I mean by that is, it takes a recognition that a political system that was set up in a colonial sense is a straitjacket.
Yeah,
that's not easy. Because, I don't know how it is there. In the States, you're told this is the only government that works, democracy.
Exactly. That is exactly what we're told here. That it's almost it's like heresy to go out in public and say, you know what, electoral democracy is really not it. And I don't believe electoral democracy in our context. If you say that, as I have been saying, you get typecast as one thing or the other. So there are a lot of people who have a lot of very funny ideas about who I am and what I represent. Some people think that I'm some sort of, Vladimir Putin is my Svengali, and I'm his African mouthpiece. Some people think maybe there's Chinese money in my bank account or something. Because the Chinese apparently have a lot of money supposedly to throw around. Some people think, oh, you're driven by hatred of white people or something. So a lot of people think a lot of things about me. Meanwhile, it's, for me, a very simple and obvious calculation that based on our local context and our local circumstances, this is what is likely to work for us. And this is what has not worked for 65 years. And this is what is clearly not going to work if we do it for another 650,000 years. So, but again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about that influx of foreign control in your civic spaces and your information spaces, where what you think of as your civic awareness and your civic knowledge is being dictated to you by people who are working for Washington, D.C.
Right.
So you're not even allowed to have a conversation, or you were not even allowed to have an honest conversation about, for example, what method of governance works for us. There was only one answer. So there was no question. There was just an answer. Right? So it's like when you're filling in a form online and there's no drop-down menu. There's just an option that has been pre-selected for you. And that answer is democracy. That's it. And even under that democracy, you're not allowed to query that. Aren't there different kinds of democracy? Then we have systems even prior to colonization that could be referred to as democratic. This sort of Greek, Athens style, one man, one vote, balloting system. Is that what democracy means? Because even the word democracy, is that what it means? Democracy it means government of the people, for the people, by the people. Right. It doesn't mean electoral balloting. That's a very specific subset of a democratic process. But the entire word has been boiled down to that. You're not even allowed to say that, because the word democracy has been equated to having a voter's card and going to, put a thumbprint next to a candidate's picture on election day. And that's it. That's your duty as a citizen. And beyond that, whatever the outcome of that is, whether the person announced as winner was actually voted for by people or not, once that announcement has been made, it's your job to stand behind the person that you didn't clearly nobody voted for. And apparently that is democracy. And if you beg to disagree, then you're a Russian puppet or something. You're a Russian agent.
Yeah, it's weird,
so
right?
that's what I mean.
No, I totally get it. The entire point of the government is to be able to get stuff done. And whatever that arrangement is, to be able to get stuff done, especially, I mean, in a situation where the government is being manipulated, like meaning when you have this quote unquote democracy in the way that they define it, and that democracy is being used and manipulated in order to give outcomes that are not in the interest of the public itself.
Yeah.
What do you do? Like, is the expectation really for the people to just submit to something that obviously is not in their best interest and not working for them? And then the moment that you rebel, they're like, oh my God, there's a hunter. Okay, what if the hunter is actually doing what it needs to be done and the public backs it? Meaning you still get public will saying, yes, this is what we want because this is actually doing the job that this other political device wasn't doing. No, I totally get your point on that. And you're right. It is a hurdle to get around intellectually to say that because, from the time you're born to the time you usually hit the grave, you're beating the head. This is what you need. This is the way it looks. This is the form of government that is the thing that actually works for the population. And then you look around and say, but that's not working for the population. And by the way, even in America, like where America calls itself the city on the hill, and you look at these guys, the United States, people in the US died like 5 years earlier than in Europe. And the US's response to that is to cut healthcare by nearly $1 trillion to the poorest in the population and give that money effectively to the rich. Like Princeton did this study, and what they found was the political will of the population only accounts for maybe 1% of influence in the political space. So effectively, what the public wants doesn't matter. And the political system is there to enshrine the fact that the public doesn't matter, but to give them rituals, like they're rituals to God or something like that, that nobody pays attention to, but they can feel good about because they were part of the ritual. No, I totally get it, man. I totally get it. I've kept you long. David, you're awesome. And I thank you for this. You're a wealth of information, like nobody's business. And I swear, oftentimes I just sit here and be like, this is fascinating. We don't get a huge amount of content about the African continent in America. And so when I finally get guests that can explain what's taking place on the ground, I am deeply appreciative of those guests. Kofi is another one. You are great on this. Thank you for this. David Hundeyin.
Hundeyin, yes.
Yeah. Hundeyin, yeah. He is an investigative journalist, author, filmmaker. He's founder of West Africa Weekly and the 2023 James Carey Fellow at Cambridge University. I hadn't asked you about this in advance. Can we mention this other thing or leave it?
Leave it?
We'll leave it. Okay, we'll leave it.
I guess we'll just leave it for now,
Yeah. Okay, we'll leave it until this thing. But David has done something fantastic. I'll just say it that way. He's done something fantastic and deserves a huge amount of praise for it. But man, thank you for this. You be safe, okay?
No worries.
Thank you. All right, David is